Welcome back to the Historians of the Movies podcast. As always, I am your host, creator, leader. Am I the leader? I guess I'm Jason. And joining me, as always, are Colin, Colbourn, Luke Truxal, and Sarah Myers in no particular order. They're just the people I saw left to right because that's how we read here in America. We're on our final episode here of Guys, we've been talking about this series for 2 months now. I was just doing the math earlier. It's like, that's a lot of Masters of the Air. How do we feel? Like we've come to the finish line. We have finished the war. We've defeated Nazi Germany. How do we feel about this?
It's a lot of Masters of the Air, but it's flown by, man. I mean, we've all agreed that there's just not enough episodes to make it right, but I don't know, it's been fun.
I agree. It's been fun, and I think that you were going to make fun of Colin for his pun that he made just now. But I was going to say we learned from the documentary, I won't give any spoilers, but we learned from the documentary that Rosie also used puns and that Cleven and Egan did as well. So I was like, we'll allow it.
Again, it was kind of a good episode to end on. And again, overall, there was this fear I think we had after the last two that this thing would kind of go off the tracks and try to do too much. And they kind of got back to what works well for the series, which is sticking with the 100th and those 4 kind of leading cast members that we've kind of centralized the plot around. So again, it's been a good series. And again, I guess we'll have our final thoughts later in the episode. So I'll kind of not spoil that.
There's no doubt that this episode makes the last episode's sort of problems a lot more stark, because what we see in this episode is a lot of not finishing any of the stories they started last week, and that I mean, yeah, pretty much. I mean, we don't get sort of resolution on several of the things that we complained about last week, which I think makes it even worse. But when they get back to that core story, to Luke's point, I think that it's great. I think it's great.
Yeah, it feels like for me this episode in a lot of ways kind of felt like a return to form for the earlier episodes. It felt like this episode was much more in line with, say, the first 6 episodes in the series. The word I kept coming away with was feelings. This episode gave me feelings. I was wistful. I was saying earlier, like later on, I watched the episode and I was going to have a good cry. Colin and I were just talking about emotions before we started recording here. I was like, God, I just feel so much better now knowing that nothing I ever do in life will compare to anything that these young men went through. And I will have nothing to contribute to society, aside, of course, from this podcast. So, there was, I had those, and you're right. Like, we didn't resolve a lot of those plot lines. So I think, and kind of saying that, watching the series kind of got a little bit uneven towards the end, maybe went off course, if we will. Sarah, Colin's not alone in the puns. It's about to be on. At the same time, I was like, I didn't know that they could stick the landing this well, especially kind of going off as well as much as they did in episodes 7 and 8. I thought there was no way we were going to be able to land this thing. And they did. I felt like this episode was really as good as they possibly could have made it. And I came away with this going, okay, yeah, this is going to be all right. I wanted to go back and watch the series again, actually, after watching this. So we ended up watching the documentary, or at least most of us did, Colin. So, let's jump into the episode. We start in February 3rd, 1945. Luke, where are we?
Sorry if you hear a cat in the background. She's kind of complaining that she's not getting enough attention.
Eat the cat, Luke.
But this is something that I think is we're in 1945. We're both in February of 1945 when we talk about the Rosie mission. But as we'll see later, the march that we see covered later on starts actually on the 27th of January. So there is some timelines off. That's okay. I was okay with that. I would have wished it would have been explained a little bit better. But the February 3rd mission that we see is a raid on Berlin. For perspective, basically everything's kind of, in terms of the war, is condensing for Germany. They're getting pushed on both sides. And as a result, they're really trying to hold on as we see the Wehrmacht collapse. I am really sorry about my cat. She's just really being a jerk at the moment. But basically, one of the problems that I had with this mission, and again, this kind of speaks to, yes, this episode returned to form and it returned to what it did well, which I thought was good, but it also returned to form in what it did not do well, which is it didn't provide context. The raid on Berlin, they do it very well in showing Rosie's perspective. They show it very well. It's almost exactly how it's written up in Donald Miller's book. It's also follows kind of the mission reports and everything that you'll see about Rosie going down. Really well done in sticking to the history there. But what Donald Miller does differently that this series did not is he puts that raid into context, which is the Berlin raid on February 3rd of 1945 is the beginning of Operation Thunderclap, which is this air offensive that the Americans carry out, which is designed to basically punish Germany and break German morale by targeting the civilians and targeting cities through punishment bombing, a tactic directly against civilians, with the hope that this will lead to the collapse of Germany as they're facing this pressure on two fronts by the Soviet Union in the east as they are pushing towards Berlin, and by the United States and the Western allies, including the British and the Canadians and the Polish and all those other allies that I failed to mention, doing their big push west to east across the Rhine River. And so this Operation Thunderclap was proposed initially in August of 44. It was rejected by the Americans. They did not want to do punishment bombing. They did not want to do area bombing. Yes, they had deviated in the past, but this would have been a clear intent to punish German civilians and kill as many as possible with the hope that this brings about an end to the war. What changes? The Battle of the Bulge changes. During the Battle of the Bulge, this shock German offensive really made the Americans realize that this war was not over, but it also led to, in particular, Hap Arnold questioning the bombing campaign and what had been working. The attacks on transportation oil had been working, but Arnold starts to question that and whether it actually was working because he didn't think the Germans could have launched this offensive if the bombing had been working. He chews out the commander of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, Carl Spaatz, and tears him a new one. And even says that maybe we should just abandon strategic bombing altogether and let's just, do these massive fighter sweeps. They come up with a really crazy plan to just do like this massive fighter sweeps and carry out air support for the ground forces and abandon the strategic bombing offensive. The operation never goes into effect, but it was called Operation Jeb Stuart. And I was just like, whoa. Yeah. Ooh. So as a part of this, Arnold decides to put pressure on Spaatz to achieve results because Arnold wants to win the war through air power alone. He wants to prove that the Air Force can be independent. So Hap Arnold starts to tell Spaatz, let's do Operation Thunderclap. He puts a lot of pressure on Spaatz to do Operation Thunderclap. This is something Spaatz is opposed to. In addition to the pressure from Spaatz, he gets it from the British, but also he gets it from Omar Bradley, the commander of the American Forces, 12th Army Group, I believe it is, basically operating on the Western Front. And he's putting pressure on him because he feels that this will help them out in their upcoming offensives into Germany. And then in addition to that, Eisenhower also decides to pressure because they think that maybe after the Battle of the Bulge, we need to do something to try to break German morale really quickly. And so Spaatz basically finally goes through with it. This is a big controversy. This is not okay with a lot of the staff, including Spatz's number one chief. When we talk about planning missions, his deputy of operations, Fred Anderson, has this quote that is just absolutely brilliant. Sums up the objections that the Americans had. Basically, he says that this will change the U.S. bombing to, quote, indiscriminate homicide and destruction, making it very clear he was not okay. Doolittle opposed the plan all the way up until the mission launched, and he was the only person who was able to get like specific targets put in as like transportation targets, but still those transportation targets are largely in the center of these cities. And so what we're seeing portrayed in this Rosenthal mission, and if you look, they show him looking over a bomb site. A lot of the bombing during this was blind bombing because of cloud cover, because of smoke from the battles and previous bombings. So this is what we see with the attack on Berlin is we see an attack against civilians. Now, there's a lot of debate over how many civilians were killed in this particular raid. I had to write it down, but the official United States Air Force history, Craven and Crate, puts the number at 25,000 killed during this raid on Berlin, that Rosenthal, 25,000 German civilians. There's another number that some German historians have put out that's much lower. I don't know why. That's something I haven't really dived deep into. Again, I think they put the number at 2,893 in that particular raid. But the consensus is that 125,000 seem to have been made, over 100,000 were made homeless by the raid. And that's just the opening of Operation Thunderclap. There's additional attacks. Again, I'm just double checking my notes here because I had to write all this out. So I'm sorry about all this. But Thunderclap, basically, let me see. Sorry about this. Thunderclap targeted the cities of Berlin, Cottbus, I apologize for not doing my German very well, Dresden, and Chemnitz. And Magdeburg was in there as well. The most famous raid as a part of Operation Thunderclap is the attack on Dresden from 14 February, and I think it continues into 15 and 16 February of 1945. In total, again, the number I've seen, the official number is about 25,000. I've seen it as high as 35 to 40,000 killed in the firebombing of Dresden. And this is the biggest one. This is the first time we see American pushback against these tactics because of how horrifying the Dresden raid was. And we've seen a lot of debate over whether it was a legitimate military target. There will be some that say that Doolittle put it as a transportation target and tried to hit the transportation. It was being used as a transportation hub, but for the most part, the consensus seems to be that this was not really, if it was a military target, it would have been a low priority military target. This is largely a way of punishment bombing. And again, this is another firestorm. We have fire tornadoes. And in one of the books, I think it's Marshall de Brule, has the temperatures reaching 1,500 degrees. People incinerated by the flames, but most were actually killed by the toxic fumes from the fire itself. And so this is the context that's missing, is that the Americans begin this punishment bombing campaign in February of 45, and it starts with Rosenthal's mission. And yes, he is the lead man on the mission. Yes, he is in the co-pilot seat. He is front and center, and it covers what happens to him very well. But the context that's missing is that this is a part of Operation Thunderclap, and this is the beginning of an American campaign to break German morale through punishment bombing. That would have helped when we get to that later conversation in the story and in the episode where Crosby and Rosenthal discuss the morality and the merits behind what they are doing in Germany. And so, again, the context is missing from this episode. Or at least this scene in this startup. So, again, that should give you some perspective that we are seeing Germany collapse. We are seeing pressure building on them, but also because of the Battle of the Bulge and that shock German offensive and that strategic bombing has been brought into question, and the American campaign has been brought into question by both Hap Arnold, Eisenhower, and Bradley, and the British to some degree as well. The Americans get away from doing what they prefer to do, which is attack economic systems and military targets, and it was working. But they start just targeting German civilians. Eventually, they do stop, and all attacks against German civilians are halted on April 9th. But the Americans do start moving away from it after Dresden because the pushback after Dresden publicly from the United States and the American public really causes a lot of alarm. And also there's pushback on the British terror bombing campaigns as well, so much so that Churchill is starting to roll back the terror bombing campaigns. So this is an important part of the story that's missing.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Dresden, because I got some questions last week from people who aren't familiar about, Dresden and why is Dresden important in the first place. So I think that I appreciate that you brought that up. And I think that there's, of course, we're telling Rosie's story, and it's a story with a sort of happy ending for Rosie, right? But I think that clearly this context is missing. I think the context of even I dug into sort of the crew that he was with, and we see them go down. We see a couple guys are dead in the airplane as as they're going down. And I think even that story is interesting. There's two still missing. The two guys that died in that crew are still missing, which means either they were thrown free or that plane hasn't been found. Four of the crew members were taken POW, so they landed on the German side. 5 of the crew members were evacuated. The pilot was evacuated, made it to a Russian service hospital where the Russians amputated his leg below his knee. But he made it out after that. So I just thought that was kind of interesting about it. I think it just goes to show, like, there's so much happening in this war. Everyone has a story, and when you sort of hyper focus in on some of these, which is good for the series, you can't focus on everyone's stories, but I think I thought that was just kind of interesting. And another couple notes, of course, you see it's a very different look in the B-17s when we're looking at this raid in February. They're unpainted. They're the aluminum, of course, B-17s. They were technically the newer model, the B-17Gs, which were up armored. They had big turrets called chin turrets on the front that were made to combat against the German fighter tactics, to sort of come at them from the front. I think that their 3D models were the F models, and they were like, we're going to stick with that. Because obviously the CGI was really good. I don't know if you guys liked, I thought the sort of slow motion of the bombs dropping and starting to sort of like, I thought that was super cool. I thought that was a really neat thing to see in itself. One more thing, the plane was spinning out of control. Rosie obviously made it out, but I wanted to quick read a sort of this is actually from a missing aircrew report. One of the guys that survived a B-17 loss, not from this group. This was actually over Yugoslavia at the time, but I just thought it was insane, so I thought I'd read it real quick. So the wing falls off the B-17. He says, "Speaking for myself, I was pinned to my seat by the centrifugal force." So again, we see that in the episode where it's starting to spin. Rosie's really struggling. Unable to move. I lost consciousness, and when I recovered, I was falling free of the airplane. I pulled my ripcord and then lapsed into unconsciousness again. Was unconscious upon reaching the ground, having no knowledge of how long I stayed in that condition, but it couldn't have been more than a half hour. So this guy is in a B-17 that's spinning out of control. He passes out, somehow gets flung free, wakes up long enough to pull his ripcord, passes out again, and makes it all the way to the ground. I don't know if that's luck or what, but I just thought that was an interesting thing, and that sort of centrifugal force that you see for a lot of these planes when they're going into those spins was deadly for a lot of these guys.
Yeah, I think that one of the things I liked about this episode, at least early on, first of all, can we say they said the words? We got to hear the words. We got to hear the words in Band of Brothers. We got to hear the Pacific all the time. But like, they said Masters of the Air. And it was nice to be in the air with the bombers again after several episodes when we really weren't, or not for very long. And hats off to the CGI people, the effects people. Like, god damn, those scenes are horrific, but also beautiful to watch. I kept thinking, watching this episode, some of the shots they were laying on, it felt like they were just going for it. They were going to leave the last images of this series in our minds, and just setting us up for the shot of Egan later on. We'll talk about with the flag. All this other stuff is like they were just hammering away at the symbolism in this one. Sarah, what do you think about the early bombing campaign over Berlin?
Well, I was actually going to say, based on what Colin was sharing, that I liked how they showed just again in this episode, kind of like you said, going back to the bombers, that they showed the chaos of trying to get out of the airplane, with all the different factors that involves and like all the decisions they have to make, from when to like be like, okay, this aircraft is beyond, right? We're not going to be able to land it, etc. Just like all those little decisions are things that baffle me that people had to make in real time. And then like the story that Colin shared was like insane, right? That guy woke up long enough is crazy. But I thought they did, like in this episode, I appreciated that they brought in again things from the memoirs, right, that we've been talking about, like Crosby and Alexander Jefferson. I appreciated that in this episode in particular. I don't think I have anything else to add at the moment. Like I have other thoughts about other things, but those were some of my preliminary ones.
I do want to go on the record to show that when Rosie got shot down and needed to identify himself as a true American, what did he shout? Coca-Cola. Yeah. So,
yeah,
I was still like Coca-Cola Roosevelt, baby. Let's go. Let's move on to the prison camp sequence. Our guys are getting moved around at last notice, and there's a lot of concern that these guys are going to get killed. We see in the documentary, which I really enjoyed watching later on, there's a real concern throughout the ranks that Hitler was just going to have these dudes shot as they're moving. And these marches in the dead of the night, it's freezing. They say it's a 100-year freeze in Germany. Luke, what's going on here with these moves back and forth? I love the fact that you're drinking out of an imperial mug right now, symbolizing Germany. I know that you plan on doing that. But what's going on here as far as these guys getting shifted back and forth? Is this going on all over Germany? How are these guys having to move around these POW camps?
It's not all the camps. It's only 3. The 3 are, let me make sure I got the list right here. At least the 3 that I know of for this march in particular. It's Stalag 8B in Poland. Then there's Stalag 3, which is in Silesia, modern-day Poland. And it looks like Stalag 4 as well. The 2 other ones I mentioned are Stalag Luft, so they're from the Luftwaffe camps. The Stalag 8B is more of a general POW camp. But the idea is that they're moving them further west to get them away from the Soviets. I suspect, and again, this is something I haven't really researched, but I would suspect that some of this is by the commanders themselves also to have a bargaining chip, because they're not just thinking about these prisoners, they're also thinking about their own hides, because they know what's going to happen. They know the nature of this war and what will happen. The march is very brutal, both on, as we can see, on the men themselves, but also the airmen and also the guards. So much of what is described on what is shown on screen is described in Donald Miller's book. It's done very well. But this is only 3 camps. Stalag Luft 1 in Barth, Germany, was actually liberated by the Soviets. And in fact, Hitler had given an order to execute the prisoners, which had not been followed by the camp commander. The camp commander tried to get away. He put on civilian clothes and was captured by the Soviets. And if I recall correctly, he was executed. But basically, when the Soviets arrived and they took over the camp, they found these orders in there from Hitler that were not followed. So again, some of these commanders are operating on their own initiative because they realize the collapse is happening, and they are also trying to think about themselves. But these 3 camps were moved from the east further west into Bavaria and to Moosburg. One of the things I liked about kind of when they arrived there is they showed basically the more international aspect of these camps and how you see multiple different nationalities. You saw colonial troops from the French there, which I thought was a nice inclusion there. There's a couple things that I thought they could have done better on. Again, they only showed really the movement of one of the groups and not even all of Stalag Luft 3. They showed only really I think it's the, I'd like to say it's the South Compounds movement, which is with Agen. And basically they march almost the entire way. And they camp one night near Nuremberg. And in fact, they nearly get bombed by the American and British when they were bombing and flattening Nuremberg towards the end of the war as a part of kind of that punishment bombing that we see towards the end of the war that becomes very much a hallmark of the end of the air war. And so it's noted by the airmen that, oh my goodness, these are some massive bombs that are being dropped. And wow, we're glad we hate the camp conditions, but we'd rather not be in Nuremberg. They get marched through Nuremberg, and they get kind of that same treatment that we saw back in episode 6, people yelling at them. One of the other groups that Frank Murphy was with actually took a train. They marched part of the way and they took a train. They were in a cattle car for most of the movement. But they were treated quite literally like cattle. They had nowhere to move, nowhere to sleep. They stood or they sat. When they arrived, he notes that they left them there that night. They basically arrived that night. They left them, locked the cars, and then went to sleep. And then when the guards woke up the next morning, they then opened them up. So they had to spend the whole night sitting there right at the new camp at Moosburg. And that is Stalag, I think, 7A. That's basically, they had to spend the night in the cattle cars. And they said because they had spent so much time there, it was hard to, with the muscles and everything, it's hard to get them out. And so they had to be forced out by the guards. So again, this march is different for different groups, but I thought they could have done maybe a little bit better job. For the most part, I was really happy with what they covered there. I don't want this to say like I'm nitpicking or really angry, but I thought they could have, again, goes back to, if you could have shown a little bit more of what's happening to the civilians, you could have done that through Nuremberg. There was an opportunity there. And I thought it was a missed opportunity. All we really see is a strafing scene. So again, there was a lot of potential there. I thought they did it really well. Again, add a little thing here or there, and I think it would have knocked it out of the ballpark.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching with my wife Rachel, and she was asking sort of like, I mean, and I think it's a fair question, and I think you sort of brought up a big answer to that. But like, if you have, they're marching these prisoners, of course, as you mentioned, there's 2 waves of them coming out of Stalag Luft 3, and there's 10,000 prisoners total. I mean, it's a huge number of prisoners. How many guards? I mean, Rachel was asking sort of like, at this point, the Germans are on the run. They're scared. That the friendlies are nearby in some way, shape, or form. What's keeping them in check? What's keeping them in line? I think that was an interesting question. Of course, my first thought was sort of keeping the group together. You're sort of like, you just want to make it to the next place. The war will end and you'll be okay. But as we're seeing, they're getting strafed. They're dying in different ways. I don't know, Luke, Sarah, if you've got some insight on that too, but I thought it was an interesting question.
They came to an agreement on the march that Egan was with. The commanding officer basically negotiated a deal with the German commander heading the march, which was basically, I think it was something like 20 miles a day. We do 20 miles a day, and we will cooperate. We'll work with you. You guys don't do any, executions because we have more of us than you. And the war's going a certain way. And so we will go with you. We will cooperate under certain conditions. And if those conditions aren't met, you're going to have a real hard time. And I, as a commanding officer, am going to have a real hard time keeping these men from trying to overthrow your guards and kill you guys. And so for everybody's to keep as many airmen alive, and also for the guards thinking from their perspective to preserve their own lives in this whole march, it's best that you agree to these terms. And so they negotiated basically the march and how much would be marched with that column. I don't know about the other columns, but again, that is something that basically the commander, the top American commander from that part of the compound, basically negotiated with the German commander how far they would march each day and some of the conditions in order to prevent some kind of uprising of the prisoners. And the Germans are kind of got their hands tied that it's they have to do it, because they could try to kill them, but if these guys get away or if they overthrow them, there's a lot of potential bad things that could happen to these guards. And so again, everybody's starting to think about what happens to them after the war. And so there is a lot of survival instincts going on from the German perspective that you have to keep in mind. So they're not doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. A lot of times they're doing this just to think, one, how do I stay alive for the rest of the war? And how do I stay stay alive after the war.
So I guess another question I have, I'm going to keep going because I did not flip through Masters of the Air for this one either. But why then escape if you've negotiated all of this and you know that escaping is really just going to put yourself in danger at that point in time? Why escape? Why these couple of guys? Buck, Bucky. Go ahead, Sarah.
I was thinking of it. I mean, Luke, you can jump in a second. That there's kind of like what they talked about. I don't know, somewhere in the episode or maybe the documentary. I might be conflating the two now, but this idea that like you've been in these camps for so long, you're starting to not lose your mind, but get a little like stir crazy. And so I thought a part of it, especially with Buck, like when they were like discussing things, I thought like, I think sometimes people are just leaving because it's like, they know the end is coming, but also they're just like so done. And just like, this is a perfect opportunity with the chaos that's happening currently. So like, let's just do it. But like, I can't speak for everybody in every circumstance, but like I did interview a man once. He did not escape, but he was with, he's on the march of the Bataan Death March. And he survived. And he said he survived because he was a mechanic. And the Japanese figured out quickly that he knew how to fix trucks. And he's like, that's the only thing that kept me alive. But he said that one of his, like, basically, like, through stories of people, he knew this, one guy who, like, escaped or whatever. And I don't know what ended up happening to that guy in the end, but he was talking about how, like, he just kind of, like, snapped and couldn't take it anymore. And so that's what I'm kind of, like, thinking about. But, Luke, you look like you were going to say something, too.
I mean, again, I have to double check, but from what I understand of the reason why Clevin escaped is that it was an opportunity. An opportunity had arisen during the march, and they noticed a chance to go. It wasn't some elaborate plan. It was more along the lines of, hey, here's an opportunity. Here's a window. Let's go. Let's take it. Let's run. And Egan helped him out. From what I understand, Egan had no intent of going with them. Egan was running security. He was one of the senior officers. But I think from Buck's perspective, I think, one, he wanted to get out, and two, I think from his perspective, there's a lack of trust here. The Americans aren't dumb. These guys might execute them. Yep. So again, an opportunity arose. Egan helped orchestrate it, provided some cover. And again, they did dramatize that a little bit, but basically it plays out a little bit differently in reality. They actually had to like hide in the mug and in some sewers to throw out. And I think Buck said something along the lines after the war that, us hiding in the muck and the sewers, we were in all this like feces and stuff. He said it threw off the dog's scent. And he says, that to us, that was like, the greatest thing in the world. We don't care if it's, all the sewer stuff that we're in. The fact that it's throwing off the dogs that are helping hunt them down was great. And so again, from what I can tell, Buck, I get the vibe that it's one, a level of resistance against the Germans. Two, he doesn't trust them, and three, an opportunity. There was a short window up that during the march that he had a chance to go, and he took it, and Egan helped orchestrate that. And I don't think they were the only ones. That was just to represent others that had fallen out of line. And again, it was happening. But again, it shows you kind of the state of the German military and the guards themselves at this point, because they're trying to keep the mass in line, but there are guys slipping in and out. There are guys slipping out of the march when they get an opportunity, and Buck is one of those.
Well, the documentary gets into this as well. It talks about how after the Great Escape, after the British get out, and then 50 men are summarily executed from that, relationships between the soldiers and the guards completely deteriorate. They're what little cordialness or what kind of relationships had been built completely evaporate at that point in time. These guys are still at war, and let's not forget, they're Germans. Do we take Germans at their word? So, you get why, if you get a chance to bail, you bail, because there's no guarantees. We still also have, again, these guys are still living through the fog of war. We know this war is coming to an end. We know it's going to be in the European theater in May. It's soon. But these guys don't know that. They have no idea exactly when they're going to be liberated, if at all, or if they're going to end up on on the end of a bayonet. So, I mean, I was surprised. I didn't know that that's what happened with Buck to get out. So I was, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that they got out.
I mean, it's not like the Americans were immune to having POWs executed. It happens during the Battle of the Bulge.
Sure.
And so Germany will execute American and British POWs. It doesn't happen with the same frequency as it did on the Eastern Front, but they'll still do it. And so it's thinking from their perspective. If you have an opening, take it. And I think it was more of a moment of opportunity. And again, I don't get the vibe. I mean, you're right. There wasn't a lot of trust in the first place, but once the executions over the Great Escape happened, what little trust there was gone. And at that point, a lot of these airmen are trying to figure out, are we going to be executed? And again, the other thing that you have to probably wonder about in their mindset, and this is something where I haven't done enough oral histories of POWs to know, but if the fronts are getting closer to the POW camps, do you wonder if you're a POW, if you're going to be executed when this whole thing ends? So you have to think that that's in their mindset as the war is coming closer to an end. Do the Germans just order your execution because they know it's all going to collapse? And so again, they don't understand that some of these German officers are thinking about their own hides. They're thinking that they're about to be executed. Others, so again, the POW perspective is really interesting. I wish, again, I haven't done enough oral histories or studied that enough, but that is definitely on their mind whether or not they will be executed. And so, especially after what happens to the British and Commonwealth officers who are executed in the Great Escape.
I actually think it's kind of a really interesting character thing that they did here. Now that you've sort of enlightened us on the sort of the real story that Egan wasn't going to go, right? I mean, in the show, they're like he was going to go, but wasn't allowed to go. Knowing that he wasn't going to go at all, I think that's even more interesting because here we sort of painted they throughout this series have painted Egan as sort of a little bit unpredictable, a little
He's
bit
a Hellraiser.
He's Hellraiser. He's kind of on the edge, and it almost seems like Buck, on the other hand, is kind of he's the calm sort of like he to me would be the one that would stay back and be like, I got to stay with the guys, like.
Right.
It's my job as an officer to sort of stick with them, and that's the only way I'm going to get them through it. But then of course he's the one in real life that actually was like, I'm out of here, which I totally understand. That I get. I just think it's an interesting character play that they've sort of done here. And especially knowing sort of that Egan wasn't going to go at all. Interesting.
Luke, you brought up something just a moment ago. I want to touch base on this real fast before we move on, which is you talked about how there were more soldiers, POWs killed on the Eastern Front with the Soviets than say on the Western Front. Does that reflect a greater maybe hatred of the Soviets? Were tensions even worse? I say after what the Germans went through trying to attack Stalingrad. And so forth, after these failed campaigns and marches into Russia, or is that just personnel? Was there a difference in the ways that Germans viewed their opposition, say, versus the Soviets or the French or the Americans, English, so forth?
This is something that I would love to have Whitman Bourne on to kind of talk about with, because he does a really good job at talking about the Eastern Front and also looking at atrocities. Carried out by, Nazi Germany. But an element of this is kind of racial hatred of basically the people living in the Soviet Union, because it includes a number of Slavic groups, a number of, you have Russians, you have Ukrainians, you have a wide range of different groups that the Nazis hate and that they have no problem with executing. The Germans are notorious during Operation Barbarossa of basically starving prisoners to death in open fields. Basically, they gather them in an open field, don't feed them, don't care for them, and just let them die. Or, if they try to escape, they kill them. And they do carry out mass executions as well. So the fighting on the Eastern Front, and again, it's a lot worse in terms of executions, atrocities being carried out. It's a real war of annihilation, and so they are treated. Even American POWs who notice the differences in how they are treated versus how those captured on the Eastern Front and from the Soviet Union are treated. Worse conditions to live in. And so, again, I think that is something that could have probably been portrayed a little bit better in the series, but it's not. That's just kind of like, that's kind of like perfect episode type thing. We got a little bit of a perspective of the Eastern Front when Rosie shot down, and how the Soviets aren't taking prisoners; they're just executing them. They did take some, but they also sent them into Siberia in prison camps. Most of the German Sixth Army went into the prison camps. I think, what was it, like over? There's something around like 200,000 were captured. I can't remember the exact number off the top of my head, but it's like 6,000 returned. So the poor treatment of prisoners on the Eastern Front is both done by the Soviets and by the Germans. And again, we see a little bit of it when Rosie shot down with the Soviets executing German POWs. The Germans would have done the same thing. So again, that's a great question. The person who could probably dive deeper into that than I could would be Waitman Bourne.
The only thing
I know
I'd
you
add
already
is
had him on theory.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, just to accentuate what Luke is saying, is that Soviets kept their camps open like after World War II. So even at a time when all the other allies were allowing people in their POW camps to leave, they kept the ones with the German POWs. So like Luke is saying, that's why so few return. And we don't, because we're in then a Cold War with them and lots of other things from great work, right, that I haven't done, is explaining, this. And so it shows the revenge or hatred that the Soviets feel towards the Germans, right? Because that fighting on the Eastern Front, etc.
All right.
There's also a persistent to this day. I mean, we actually have received emails about this at Project Recover. There's a persistent conspiracy that 20,000 American POWs who were in German camps were then transferred out to Soviet camps as well, which ended up being Congress actually ended up having to look into it, I think in the 1990s or early 2000s. And they found out that there was, of course, there's not 20,000 that were, it's not what happened. There was some kind of clerical error that made the numbers look weird on some page. And that has sort of consistently gone. And then, of course, throughout the Cold War, are they keeping, our POWs from North Korea? Are they keeping our POWs from Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera? So anyway, it's just it's interesting how that sort of Soviet POW side just becomes kind of a black hole. And of course, most Germans do not, as Luke mentioned, come back from that.
All right, I want to move on. The Holocaust, for obvious reasons, has been an important part of this film, or the series, becoming more and more a part of it. And here we really finally get that final reckoning when Rosie encounters one of the concentration camps as he's making his way back to the UK. Can we talk a little bit about what happened with Rosie? Did this actually happen, Luke? He came across it?
This is something I didn't have enough time to double check. I was looking at some other stuff, particularly looking at some of the mission stuff with Dresden and stuff. So I apologize. I didn't get enough time to really look into whether or not Rosie was at one. But they're definitely foreshadowing his post-war role in that he will play an active role in prosecuting. In fact, he was on the prosecution team that I think basically went after Hermann Goering. So he plays a big role at Nuremberg as one of the lawyers. And in fact, he went back to his civilian job for a brief time after the war as a lawyer, and then decided, you know what, that's it. I can't do this. He volunteers to go be one of the lawyers working at the trials at Nuremberg to prosecute the Germans who've committed a wide range of crimes against humanity. Not just the Holocaust, but also there are other crimes that are included as well, in addition to the Holocaust, such as treatment of POWs is one of them. So again, that is definitely a little bit of foreshadowing that they're doing with the story. I don't know if it happened. From what I understand, he was picked up pretty quickly, taken to an airfield, then flown to Poltava, then flown
around the world, to
basically.
England.
I think, did he go? Was it Tehran that he went to next?
He went to Tehran.
Yeah, I was trying to remember. And then he gets on like Churchill's plane and then flies. It's really kind of crazy when you see what happened to getting back to Thorpe Abbotts. What is interesting is as soon as he gets to the Soviet lines, he radios back. He finds a way to radio back to Thorpe Abbotts that he's alive, and he basically says, "Save me a B-17 for when I get back." Because his plan was when he got back to get back in the plane. So he was letting them know that he wanted to get back into combat as soon as he got back. So he was shot down actually a couple other times in the war, but he always found a way to get back to the Allied lines. And this is not the first time he fractured his arm. This is like the second time I think he fractured his arm bailing out of a plane. And so he was wounded several times in the war. The first time he was shot down, he basically worked his way to the Western Allied lines. The second time, he worked his way to the Soviet lines. So again, very interesting story. And again, morale always dropped when they thought he was shot down. And then it came back up again once he was there. And again, his role, I mean, it's noted even in like other histories of the war looking at like morale, that they said he is a great case of how a person can influence group morale. And again, this gives us an indication of that character of who Rosie is, which is this dedication to a cause, which his cause is to fighting evil. You know, after the fighting in Europe, he tries to get in a B-29. He does training on a B-29 to fight against Japan. And then the war ends. And then he goes back to civilian life. And then he decides, no, I can't do that. I got to go fight the good fight and help with the prosecutions at Nuremberg. So this tells you a lot about his character. And, you know, his character is very consistent, not just in how the show portrays it, but in real life. He has this dedication, this sense of duty, this sense of, I don't know if responsibility, but this sense of that I need to do what is right. I have an obligation. I have certain obligations in life to do good. And so that gives you kind of an idea into who Rosie is as a character. And that's one of the easiest, in some ways, it's very easy to write because you don't have to do a lot of character development with him because that's who he is.
He's a remarkable person. Absolutely.
Luke, you said he broke his arm a couple times, bailing up, and he hurt himself a couple times. Do you think that's because the parachute was having trouble balancing for the size of his nuts? I mean, because this guy.
It is incredible. It is incredible.
I mean, just insane.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was going to say about the concentration camps because I did dig around. I mean, I didn't get to do an extensive search, but I didn't find any evidence that he did, was at a camp. That doesn't mean that he wasn't. I don't know, Colin, if you know anything about this.
I don't.
Okay.
I know that he wasn't alone. I know that some of the guys that he went down with were actually with him. Some of the guys from that crew.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you want to say more about that or?
No.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, because I was just going to say, I think that they used him to do what Luke said, to set up like how he's going to feel, because they've already referenced him as Jewish throughout the show, right? To show, but I also think they used him to represent, because there's no opportunity really for them in this show to show what it's like for people who are liberating the camps, right? Or who experience them firsthand. So I think they used this moment to kind of sneak that in and be like, this is what, how people found it traumatic when they saw what the camps really were, sort of thing.
And I want to reiterate something. Oh, go ahead, Luke. Go ahead, buddy.
Well, this kind of gets into when we talk about, we've kind of touched up on it with Egan and with Rosie and what they wrote here. And this kind of gets into what I was texting you guys earlier about with regards to the theme of the episode. But as I said, 7 and 8 in our text, I couldn't make a theme out of that because, well, basically it was all over the place at times. But with this episode, it's the men they were, the men they are, and the men they will be after the war. We see this with Egan, going from the hotshot pilot that's very erratic and in many ways self-centered at times, who will not take on responsibility, to now he is taking that responsibility on for the larger group of POWs at that time. With Rosie, it's, he has this sense of duty. That character stays consistent, but it shows you that the man he's going to be in the future is not going to be a warrior on the battlefield or some hotshot pilot. He's going to carry that sense of duty into the courtroom, And, we see it with Crosby going from kind of this nice, goofy guy to talking about his own struggles about his role in the air war and what the air war has done to him, to a family man. And then we get it with Clevin, which is, again, kind of this very tough, again, these early pilots, they make a point of saying that they were kind of hotshot, romanticized, kind of that Top Gun-like pilot. Later pilots are not like that as much, largely because they didn't come up in the Air Corps at the same time. But this is a guy that, as they foreshadow, is going to deal with loss a lot after the war. And we see it with, him losing another POW that they have. We see him, we see that he's going to lose a lot and have to deal with grief. And he makes that comment, as they're taking off for the last time, Egan's asking what he's thinking about. And, Clevin says, I'm thinking about all the guys we left behind. So again, if we talk about their characters changing, basically they're using some of these character stories in this last episode to basically bring everything into perspective for the viewer, which is who they were, who they are at this moment, and who they will be when the war ends.
And personally, Clevin dealt with grief after the war with Marge, like his wife, who died a short time after the war. Yeah. Then you have Egan die when Egan's only 45 years old. So it's like he's losing these two key figures in his life early on.
I mean, they really are, right? Marge and Egan are like the two like loves of his life. Like, whether you want to say romantic and fraternal, whatever, but they're the two. Everything we know about Clevin is that these are the two cornerstones of his life, and the documentary talks about, or in the credits we see, he keeps Marge's image, there on the mantle. The rest of his, I mean, just breaking. But we also see this with Egan's wife, where she mourns him, the rest of her life. I know, I saw that, I was so happy. I was like, yes, Sarah. I want to talk about leaving. This is our last episode of Masters of the Air. I wonder, you guys have obviously, this is your forte. We saw this. There's a tinge of melancholy when we watch Band of Brothers, that last episode after they've taken the Eagle's Nest and these guys are playing baseball and Colin's rocking back and forth his chair, right?
You stole this right out from under me. I was literally going to say the same thing, Jason.
I am a pirate of history, and now it's Colin's turn. I want to talk about this. Like, how do these guys feel? Is there a thing where these guys are really, after the hell they've been through, is there an idea of mourning, a sense of loss that they're leaving this behind at this point in time? Colin.
Okay, so my overall thought on this, I don't know if I have an exact answer to your question, but my thought on this is, this may be a controversial opinion. I think we left on a little bit too high of a note in this series.
Ooh.
I think we left a little bit too of like, and they were brave too, and then we flew off into the distance. Band of Brothers, stole this right out from under me, because I really loved, and maybe this is only in hindsight now, actually, but I really loved the ambiguity of that last episode, the ambiguity of, like, I mean, if you remember, like, the post-war occupation, one of the guys gets shot just, like, on patrol, the war is over. They're playing the baseball game, and it's like, he died in a car accident, and he did this, and it's like, life goes on.
Ending. Yeah,
it's not really a happy ending. It's kind of, we have the series, and I think that celebrates what they did and their bravery. I don't think you have to say it out loud in many ways, but a lot of these guys. I mean, first off, of course, I have so much on this. So, with this series, I feel like in Europe, as the war is coming to end, it's like you're coming from darkness and you're going into light, right? Like, it's like, the war is ending, and now we're delivering food with fresh oranges to the Dutch, and
everyone's about to die.
Everyone, all of our favorite characters survived, and we're all happy, and they're all going home. And yet, for me, it's like, at the exact same time, if you're talking about April, May 1945, in the Pacific, this is sort of the darkest part of the whole war. You know, America's favorite, war correspondent, Ernie Pyle, goes over to Okinawa and gets killed. We have the highest single, month of casualties in the entire war on one battle at Okinawa during May. President Roosevelt has died, and there is nothing but darkness on the other side of the world. And it's interesting to me that we're sort of riding this wave of just like, from darkness to light. And I thought there could have been a better opportunity. I kind of feel like the only way they did it was with this guy Needhammer, the George Needhammer, the guy that Buck's like, hey, I know that guy, and then Bucky and him, they do their little exchange about baseball, and then he gets bayoneted, right? Like that's the only kind of like, oh yeah, these guys are not sort of out in the clear anymore, and random things like this can happen. By the way, he's a real guy who was in that POW camp that did die. I don't know how he died, but he actually was a real person. But there's a lot of, and this could come from my perspective because I study loss. I study a lot of these horrific stories. And so it feels good to say, and I'm the first one to say I love feel good movies. I don't know. I felt a little sense of like, ooh, kind of missed an opportunity there to go for sort of the ambiguity of that war ending and everyone who had died in it and all the unfortunate things that happened.
I could not agree more. I thought that they're just leaving. I even thought it was just sort of odd. Like, so I was thinking about that last scene where it's not even really a scene, but it's like a, shot of, there's the crash plane, the cows in the field in England as they're taking off in the sky. And I was thinking like, that's the only moment where they're sort of showing us like, they're leaving behind, like for people who were in basically every theater around the world, except for the United States, they're leaving behind a wake of, landscape tragedy, right? There's like crash planes, environmental things people are going to deal with, people have to rebuild, etc. But we're flying away from that. But in general, like they're not, because even in the documentary, they talk about the trauma and grief people experience. But like you said, Colin, even at the end of the last episode, when they're showing us like, hey, here's what happened to the main characters kind of thing, right? Even then, I just thought like they could have done like a little slide of like, and these are the men that you saw in the show that we lost, right?
Oh,
that would have been so great. Absolutely. Instead, it was, hey, these guys survived. Oh, look, we're so happy. America won. Like fascism was defeated, So it's just like, okay, but also we just spent an entire 9 episodes with you and you showed us all these people who died. Why can't you just put their names on the screen for like 2 seconds or something? Just because we said it earlier, when we were talking about like grief for Clevin and how he loses Egan and Marge, like Egan's wife, Josephine, who's the Women Air Force service pilot, she never remarries. So she's like a lot of other, people who get married. They got married after the war, but it also represents war brides as well, who will get married and then like never remarry. So there were like so many examples of this, just to show you like the grief that people carry with them then for their entire lifetimes. And like she in particular, because we have to talk about her. Her name is Josephine Pitts, and she and Egan were from the same hometown. She was actually 2 years older than him, and she got her like bachelor's degree in chemistry, and then got her pilot's license, and was in one of the very first WASP classes. So she got to fly B-17s like he did, which I just thought the whole time I was watching the show, and every time, especially that end scene or whenever he talked to Buck about Marge, and he sort of seemed at times like sentimental that he didn't have a Marge in his life kind of thing. I just thought, well, you just wait, because you're going to have a woman who's flown B-17s and you guys can reminisce about it and it's going to be great. But she also flew a lot of other aircraft because she was in ferrying. So she flew a PT-19, C-47, P-47. That's just what I found that's possible in the records, that there are other planes that she flew. But they end up having 2 daughters together. He dies when he's 45 years old. But now she's like buried with him at Arlington. So they're like she got to be buried with military honors just like he did. And so again, I also, okay, there's one more thing about grief and trauma and whatever that I wanted to bring up, because we talked about the British and the portrayal of the British the whole episode. And Luke, I thought of you at one of the last scenes. So when the children, they're showing the children, dressed in their Sunday best, as they said, right, who are coming out and kind of like cheering them on as they left. The children are all saying, they won, they won. And I was like, this is so fascinating, because it's like an American show. The British children are saying they won. Like the Americans won the war for them, even though they've been fighting the war since 1939. And so I was just like, oh my God. Like even in the like little tiny details, they're like, we got to do one. We haven't hit up the British enough. We got to do it one more time by having the British children say they won. That was a moment for me. But anyways,
they even had like the civilians sort of like waving from their house, and then they all turn around together and walk back.
I don't know if you saw it, but when they were on their way to the Netherlands to drop off the food and supplies, they actually dropped a bunch of tea in the ocean. So just to rub it in one last time. I did, Sarah. Also, I kept thinking about Lena May Riggy as well, John Basildon's wife.
Yep, never remarried.
I remember you and I. Yeah, you and I had that conversation a few years ago. I remember we talked about her.
Yeah.
And I never heard the term war bride before.
And and again, another hero just to go to, just to sort of get killed in a horrible way. It's just, it's hard. I really feel at the end of this, you feel sort of we're 80 years later and we're really looking back on how great this was and not feeling the sadness and the trauma that was there in May 1945.
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with what y'all said. I mean, I thought it was a little bit too much of an optimistic note to end on for a wide variety of reasons. One of Crosby's close friends, one of the original members of the 100th Bomb Group, is shuffled back in 44 because the commander Jeffries at the time is realizing there's a lot of these guys from the original group that either need to go reassigned to the States just to chill out, or they need like Crosby to do a 4-week leave, then come back. One of those guys, I can't remember his name, but basically he was transferred to basically I think it's like a ferrying outfit, basically doing ferrying missions in the States with C-47s, died in a C-47 crash, just an accident. And it shows you that there are people still dying in this war. And it's one of those casualties that it's like, but he's out. And again, they did this in Band of Brothers at the end where they explained, I think it was Malarkey that got hurt on his way. No, it wasn't Malarkey. It was it's the guy that was really good at shooting. I can't remember his name off the top of my head. But he was kind of the more quiet one. But basically, they show that some of these guys, even when they're being transferred back, and you think they're safe in the States or they're on their way back, with the send-off that the British give, yes, that actually does happen. There's a lot of them, but basically the ground echelon and the fighters, they go by boat. The larger planes, because they have these massive planes that can do the full flight, they do fly out and they are waved off by the local communities. But in some cases, they leave very quickly and you don't see the wave off. There are some children that they've known these guys and they've known the ground crew for was it 1942, 2-3 years. And they've built very close relationships. When these guys go, it happens very fast. And some of these kids all of a sudden are like, they're gone. This person that's been like a key person to me that I've hung out with for 2 to 3 years has disappeared, especially like the ground person. All of a sudden they're in trucks and they're gone, and so, and life all of a sudden goes back to quiet. We go from like this hustle and bustle of an Army Air Force base with bombs and stuff and everything moving around and, organized chaos and there a lot of noise. All of a sudden it's back to quiet farm life. And so, again, it's another one of these, again, as I said, it was a very good episode, but again, it highlights that there were some missed opportunities throughout this episode. And that was one of them where I think a more somber note, a more kind of good way to do that would have been probably to use a little more somber music. And also maybe when Clevin mentions, as they're firing up the plane, I'm thinking about all the guys that we left behind, maybe as they're taxiing, start like, on one scene, show them taxiing to the runway. And then on another scene, do kind of like Gettysburg did with the pictures of the guys, showing the character and the actor and the actual person, and just kind of talking about their fates. And, that way we acknowledge their loss and have that somber takeoff, which was actually probably more accurate rather than this more uplifting takeoff that we saw. Again, this is a little bit nitpicky, but again, I think it would have ended the series with the right note, kind of like the way that you saw with Band of Brothers and with the Pacific ending with kind of the PTSD struggles of Eugene Sledge. So again, I think that this would have stuck the landing a little bit better than, say, what they chose.
I think you could even mention like number of casualties, and we talk all this about this being the bloody 100th. Like, maybe give us a little statistic about, out of so and so original folks that went over, only this many came back or something. I don't know. I think it is a small thing, but I think it's an important thing because that, especially as I look back on Band of Brothers, it really stuck with me that last episode, the way they really made it very ambiguous in many ways.
All right, we've now invoked Band of Brothers. We've been trying to not talk about Band of Brothers, but I feel like now we finished the series, we finished our 9 episodes, Masters of the Air. We can go ahead, and now I want to kind of close in by talking about a few different things. I do want to talk about where this series fits in with, say, Band of Brothers versus the Pacific. What we'd like to see next, if there's going to be another series on World War II, or if there's a Vietnam series or something like that, if there's a storyline, a book line, something like that you like, that you would like to see. And finally, who was your most captivating character? So let's start with, where does this fit in? Let's talk about Band of Brothers, Pacific, Masters of the Air. Do you have a preference as far as 1, 2, 3, your favorite, least favorite? Where does this series compare to the other two? Colin?
Wow. That's a good question. I need to watch it over again all in one sitting, because I did not watch Band of Brothers. I might have, but of course, since it came out, you basically over a weekend you binge it, and
absolutely multiple years I've done that.
Yeah, when it all flows into itself, I really think that can up the quality in many ways because you're not sort of waiting in between. So with that being said, I still think Band of Brothers is going to be my favorite one out there. I think it has the best cast with the most well-developed characters. All these other, of course, they're real people, but like you really get to know a lot of these guys. The Pacific, very close to me, of course. My students are writing their papers on With the Old Breed right now. For my military history class, and it's great. It's got its problems. I think again, I need to watch this over again. This could slot in between them. Could be Band of Brothers the best, maybe then Masters of the Air, then the Pacific. But it's hard. It's hard to say for me. I will say that I really enjoyed the Pacific. However, I just, like I'm sure Luke is feeling, you just feel like, why choose these sources versus other ones? Why do this versus other ones? There's so many interesting questions. And I'm sure someone who's an expert on Easy Company is thinking the same thing about Band of Brothers. But that's my very complicated answer to where it falls.
Sarah, how do you feel?
So I have a hot take in comparison because I actually like the Pacific better, but it's probably because I am less read in the European theater, actually. So I don't know, but that kind of contradicts what Colin just said about why he likes the Band of Brothers better. But I don't know. I don't think Masters of the Air beats either one. Like, I don't see it as higher than these two. So that's why I'm kind of struggling. I think it's just third for me still. But I mean, I haven't rewatched it and I haven't sat with it. So.
No, I don't think that's a bad take at all either, Sarah. I think you would, even just hearing you talk, I'm like, okay, maybe it is not the best. Like, it's so fresh for me. It's a little bit difficult, but I think they're all necessary. But sorry, go ahead.
No, that actually fits in line because Sarah, like when you and I became friends, I was actually rewatching the Pacific, and I would text you. I'd be like, hey, what's going on over here? And you would kind of fill me in. And I have often thought Band of Brothers gets a lot of the attention and so forth, but Pacific has aged really well over time. It is, especially to watch a singular episode, because I go watch Band of Brothers, I'm all in for 10 hours. I'm just go. But Pacific, I can watch like a single episode and be satisfied. So I don't know, Luke, what do you think? Where do you rank these?
Basically, I do have them ranked, but I would say the Pacific would be number one for me because it does a good job of melding the idea of being more ambitious in what it's going to cover in terms of topics, but still having the execution in terms of plots and trying to keep viewers hooked in and not getting too off track. Also, it does a good job of talking about some of the parts of the war that Americans don't really feel comfortable watching on screen, which is war crimes, PTSD, some of these other things. So it does a really good job of ripping away the romanticism of the fighting in the Pacific. And again, they cover more plots than just kind of the fighting and the men and the units they're in. And so it has a little more ambition than Band of Brothers, which focuses on the company and provides a little more context. But at the same time, it still has that execution, which I love. So I would rank that higher. Band of Brothers is number two. While it's less ambitious, they're very good at what they did. They knew what they were going to do. They knew they were going to stick with the company and tell the story of a company from D-Day, from training to the end of the war. And they executed that very well. They kept their focus. And when they brought in other plots, when they brought in other things, it was kind of with the company history. But at the same time, they were able to do it while keeping the company as kind of the center focal point. Masters of the Air is the most ambitious of the three series in what it tried to cover and what it tried to do. But because it tried to do too much with not enough time, it is the third because they just tried to do too much. And that really hurt it. The other problem with Masters of the Air is they focused too much on the source material coming from the group and the American Airmen, which hurt their perspectives in broadening and putting those perspectives in context like the Pacific did. It's still very good. But the reason why I have my frustrations with this series is largely because of the nature of the ambition. They basically thought that they might be able to try to do more than any of the other series. They tried to do more in a World War II series than really anything I've ever seen. That ambition was very much there, which I appreciated, but they needed at least 2 seasons, at least 12 to possibly as many as 20 episodes to cover everything that they wanted to cover. And as a result, the series suffered. But then you also throw in, by focusing too much on the source material of the airmen, they did not have that context when they needed it to talk about these other things like we see in the Pacific and like we see in Band of Brothers. So again, it's still very good. I know I've ripped this show a few times, but in my opinion, it is the best show on the air war from the American perspective. But it could have been so much more because of that ambition. So the potential was always much higher. But and to their credit, they tried to tackle a lot. They just needed more time, and that is, I think, where they really hurt themselves.
Yeah, if I can also weigh in here, because I'm not a specialist like the three of you in here, just a generalist in American history. I felt like also this Luke, you said the magic number. If you're going to do this in a single series, I felt like this needed 12 episodes to really, because you could have really layered in the Tuskegee story a bit better. You could have started earlier with them and Al. I feel like we could have introduced those gentlemen earlier to have a better relationship, because when we did see them, they were absolutely captivating. And you had the hint that there was really going to be maybe this fifth character emerging out of that group. And we never quite got that. For me, it's Band of Brothers just because I feel like it's endlessly watched. Of any series, I probably watched that. Like Colin's just saying, you watch Band of Brothers and you're on the couch all weekend. It's so rewatchable. The music, the styling, it's obviously emerging. It's far superior even to, say, Saving Private Ryan, from which obviously all of this emerges. I think it's phenomenal storytelling, but I also think that Pacific is really, really good. This is a good series. I'm really happy we watched it. These guys got their due, and I feel like it's definitely worth watching. It's really good. What I've got coming out of this is I actually want more, and I want other stories now. if we're going to continue on with World War II. Now we did get the Tom Hanks standalone film that came out a few years ago. We haven't seen a lot of World War II movies coming out more recently, so I'm kind of wondering, with you guys being specialists in this, are there movies that should come out? Are there books that you think would be great series, or events that really haven't been covered, a la Band of Brothers, Pacific, Masters of the Air, that we need to see next about World War II? What if you were going to create a World War II series with HATM money? I'm going to give you 10 episodes, maybe 12 if you can convince me. What do we have? Sarah?
I would love to see something non-combat related, because I was thinking about this, right? Because I always talk to my students about how, I know, the majority of people who served in these wars, right? Because when I'm talking about just the larger US history, I'm like, the majority are in like support roles, right? Or thinking about the mechanics. Like it's like a long story, but I met someone recently whose dad was a mechanic during World War II on planes in the United States and later in England briefly. And he was telling me about it, and I was like, oh, this is so great. Like, you should really record your dad's history somewhere. I know your dad passed away, whatever, because we just have so little on people like that, right? Like, because we haven't paid attention to them. And so the American public, even their perception of veterans is always combat, even though that's not the reality. So I would love to see, obviously, you know that I'm going to say the Wasp because I'm biased. But if I had to make a compromise with someone and have it not be the Wasp, I would say that I would love to see something that is about a non-combat unit and what they did. Like, or it doesn't even have to be a unit. It could be, I don't know, a MOS, like focus on an MOS in different places. I don't know.
Luke?
I mean, if it's going to be another combat unit in the same style as kind of what we've seen here, I think the most obvious choice is looking at the story of the Enterprise in the Pacific, because they cover so much. Now, I know there's going to be people that roll their eyes, like Colin, because it's like, well, that's been done. There's been documentaries and stuff, but that's also something people are more familiar with, either through Star Trek or because it has played such a big role in the war in the Pacific. There's other stories you could tell in there. You know, you could, if you wanted to do a standalone movie, you could do The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. That's a book that you could convert into a movie, the Battle off Samoa Island, where destroyers charged a Japanese battleships and cruisers into certain death, and they were destroyed and sunk. So basically, it's kind of a Thermopylae of the sea. So that'd be a good standalone movie.
Ooh, what is this? Luke, what is this?
The book's called The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors. It's the battle off Samoa Island during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. That would be a great one to do, which, you could do it as a standalone movie. And basically, destroyers charged Japanese battleships and cruisers and one of the main Japanese fleets. And they did so to protect the escort carriers as they were trying to flee and to buy time for basically help to arrive. I think all destroyers were sunk during that attack, and several at great loss of life. But the net result is by their actions, they convinced the Japanese fleet that they were not engaging, shall we say, the landing force and the support vessels for the landing force. They were engaging Halsey's larger fleet, and so they turned around and retreated. So these destroyers, while they did all sink, and they were all sunk by the Japanese, and Colin could probably go in more into that since he's an expert on the Pacific, they did convince the Japanese to turn back their battleships and their main force, and I think the Yamato was a part of that task force. So again, if you want a standalone film, that's a great one. Also, if you wanted to do something that's non-combat, like Sarah put, you could do The Wasp. There's a bomb group. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head. There's a bomb group that mutinied or was accused of mutiny during World War II. It was an all-black bomb group that was supposed to fly heavy bombers. That's a topic you could cover. If you want to cover, we don't get enough films sometimes about staff officers and people working in staff positions and the stress of staff. We got a little taste of that with Crosby, but I think we could do a whole thing on it. But again, obviously that would have to compete with, the movie about the Bismarck from like the 50s. So yeah, there's a lot out there that you can do a lot. But if you're talking about combat TV series, because of how long the Enterprise was in the Pacific, naval aviation, that makes the most sense to me. And I know a lot of people would love to see it, but I know that it will probably make some who are tired of hearing about the Enterprise a bit frustrated.
I don't care. I want a Navy. I want a Navy series now. Like my grandfather served in Korea on the Navasota, which is a tanker, and I've loved the Navy since I was I was actually about to join the Navy when I met my ex-wife. I had to drop 8 pounds so I could go through, and because I was going to like join, I was like, fuck it, I'm going to go be a linguist and learn Japanese. And then I met my wife, and then my whole world actually was sunk. So there was that. Colin, what do you think?
Oh man, you guys are the worst.
Are we stealing your ideas?
All my ideas. Luke even came up with a better ship than I was going to. That's why I rolled my eyes. The Enterprise is a great idea.
I was going to do a Klingon joke, and then Luke was like, "But Klingon's like, go on."
Enterprise is a great idea. Yeah, number one on my list is Naval Air War. I think that there is, I think it's great because we have Midway, and that was good. I'm going to put that in like the good category. But I think that you could do such amazing things with the Naval Air War, especially as much as we were getting our ass kicked at the beginning, and really moving forward with that. Second on here, I had Naval Battles Late Takeoff, so Luke stole that one from me as well. And last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors is an amazing idea, and you could even go a Titanic route with that because they just found the USS Johnson, or believe they found the USS Johnson at like 15,000 feet deep or more than that, off the coast of the Philippines as well. So you could start with sort of the underwater vehicle finding the destroyer. I think that the Battle of Leyte Gulf in general, just the complexity of it, following maybe a couple different ships in off Samar, off Lingayen, off of all the little battles that took place that were part of the broader battle, would be an incredible thing to follow, and you could build a whole series around that. And the tin can focus, Luke, that's a great idea in itself. So Luke, as always, stealing my thunder there. I think more submarine stuff would be really cool.
Yeah.
I think that would be really neat. There's at Truck Lagoon, which is I've spent a lot of time on. So think of submarines, not just the idea that the submarines are out there sinking Japanese ships, but they're also out there as lifeguards and rescuing downed American airmen, and in some cases heroically so, which is a very fascinating, I think, facet that people don't really think about too much on the submarine side. Sarah, of course, had the genius idea of talking about non-combat stuff, which is absolutely true. We need so much more of that. My non-combat option, and this is close to me that I don't think anyone would want to watch a movie on, would be Graves Registration. I think the World War II Return of the Dead program, after the war, of course, this is a World War II story, but it's really after the war. This is a group of people that are going out, U.S. Army, but also anthropologists, and you have odontologists out there, using the technology of the time to identify all, hundreds of thousands, really, of sets of remains in order to confirm their identity and try to get them back home to their families. And in many cases, failing and or, having their own issues. There's aircraft, one C-47, I think, was with Graves Registration folks on it, along with the remains of several of the guys that they had found, went down itself, and they are missing. And so there's stories abound there. And then, of course, Tristan Krause, who's a graduate student at I think A&M, has been doing some interesting work on the intersection of the International Tracing Service and American Graves Registration after the war in Europe. Of course, Tracing Service trying to track down Holocaust victims and help with those efforts out there too. That to me is really interesting. So I think the post-war casualty accounting and all that kind of stuff, it's a massive program that went on for years all around the world, and I think it's something that no one knows about, and I think it's just an interesting thing we could have a series on.
These are fascinating. This last stand of the Tin Can Sailors is to me. I've never heard of this. This is absolutely Luke. The way you just pitched this as Thermopylae of the Sea, I'm in right now.
Oh, I got you better than that. The captain of the USS Johnson was a Cherokee.
Who? What was his name?
Evans, Captain Evans.
Oh, see, I wrote about. Who was it? I wrote about Cherokee soldiers and sailors in World War One, and there was an admiral during World War II who was Cherokee, and I'm having trouble with his name right now. I'll have to pull it up the story because he was fast. They have a lot of his personal effects at the Cherokee Museum in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. I had a chance to see. I'll put it up on the show notes on the Substack a little bit later on. Sarah, I think you're absolutely right.
By the way, it was the Yamato that ripped it into pieces. Just incredible story.
Sarah, you're absolutely right. I'm thinking about the home front actually, and you were saying the Wasps. I was thinking about the Waves as well. Oh, Jocko Clark. That's who I'm trying to remember right now. But
the Women's Army Corps.
Yeah, you could do a women-centric story on this, and of course, that for the war junkies, like women are obviously very close to these front lines and having real relationships with, as you pointed out in Indian story, with these combatants of the war, right? I also kind of want to see a drama set during the war at home, on the home front, just about people trying to live their lives in the shadow of the war. And maybe more conventionally, when I was at Wichita State and I was doing I was going through my undergrad, I had to take a course on World War II and film. We all had to write a book review. And I read Rick Atkinson's The Day of Battle, which is about the American campaign up through Italy. And he's got a trilogy. There's the Atkinson, I think, is An Army of Dawn, I think, is in North Africa. And then I think he's got one where they actually get injured. I didn't read the third piece. But I really liked what I had read. I don't know how that stacks up professionally as scholarly work, but I would really like to see the Italian campaign. Or, I mean, we haven't seen North Africa since Patton on screen. That's 50 years. So those are things I would like to. And they mentioned that actually in Fury, too, where Brad Pitt's like, I started off killing Germans in Africa, now I'm killing Germans in Germany, right? These are parts of these stories as well I'd like to investigate. All right. Favorite character in the series? We're winding down. Who stole the show for you? Luke?
The one with the most potential was Crosby, but I think 7 and 8 kind of turned me off on that plot. But I would have to say Egan is probably the best with regards to character development, beginning to end. And so and Callum Turner's execution of the script that he was given was spot on. Not to knock, was it Anthony Boyle? But he did a good job with what was given. But I think the 7 and 8 episodes really hurt his. That cost me on Crosby. That kind of dropped Crosby down to like number 2. But I'd say Callum Turner as Egan really nailed it because you see the development all across the season. And again, even at the end where he is now shouldering more responsibility, he goes from a guy that's just kind of dodging and trying to find ways to fly planes and not take up responsibility of being a senior officer to where now he is going to be a senior officer and take on that responsibility. So I thought that's my favorite because of the character development.
Colin?
Gotta be Sandra Westgate.
I'm saving you, Sarah, for the last.
It's gotta be Sandra Westgate for me. Clearly the best storyline in the show, and we have no idea what happened to her at all. So glad they spent so much time on Sandra Landry. Gotta go with Egan as well. Callum Turner was spectacular. Even that sort of ending in this finale here with the flag and all that kind of stuff was
good show. That's good.
That guy's epic. I mean, he was really good. So my favorite, also Egan.
I'm also going to say Egan because I literally said last night as I was watching the episode, I said Callum Turner embodied Egan. Like his mannerisms, the way he carried himself, he just immediately sold me on himself as Egan. Like, I don't know. Yeah, it's just the little subtle things. Even I was just very impressed. I was like, he should win an award for this performance because he's really like selling it to me. And then I really liked how, so in the documentary they said that Egan and Clevin were, they were, these big personalities, and how they would like cock their hats to the side, right, their officers' caps, etc. But then how they would tell like lieutenants to, hey, lieutenant, like in the like officers clubs, they would say, hey, lieutenant, come taxi on up to me. Like, I want to talk to you or whatever. And I was like, Callum Turner could totally pull off that line that supposedly happened in real life. Like everything that he did, I was just like, yep, I'm convinced. You did great. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's a little bit also, and this is hard because I'm not an actor. I don't like critiquing actors very much. But Austin Butler's just kind of flatline. It's just kind of a
little flat,
just like a little flat line. Not much there. I know it's sort of reflecting his sort of like cool, calm, but like it doesn't offer a lot of range. And exactly what you're saying, Sarah. It was just fun to watch Callum Turner.
I think we were sold Austin Butler going into the show because he's certainly rising. He's did the Elvis thing. He's in Dune Part 2, which is just phenomenal. He's got a whole bunch of stuff coming up. A lot of people aren't familiar with Callum Turner. He was the Boys in the Boat, and I think that's really a lot of the stuff that. And every time you're watching the show, the question you have is, what's going on with Egan? You find yourself continually drifting back to like, when are we going to see Egan again? He's the heart and soul of the show. He's phenomenal. If there's anyone I thought that was like maybe underplayed, I wanted to see more, was Rosie. Like, I thought that when Nate Mann was incredible. Nate Mann was like the cool guy that we never really got to see out of Austin Butler. I thought just like maybe the conscience of the show in some ways, where obviously Crosby's narrating this, but we get a sense that you're kind of tied to this in different ways with Rosie, and there's this other story there. And I just thought that Rosie, the guy who played him, Nate Mann, played him really well. But it's Egan's show. This is
no. He played him well. I totally agree. And of course, like Rosie's story, like I feel like anyone could play Rosie's story is so amazing that like anyone could play him and it would be great. I thought he had the look. I thought he had that.
I keep thinking that to like the. I want to dress like Rosie. Like I want to. What's handsome? Like that dude is like just.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a show full of handsome guys, and you're like, Jesus Christ, this guy. It's like,
But I again, to your point earlier, I was not drawn to him. You stated it really well. I was always trying to figure out like what's Egan doing, like I really wanted that story every time.
To be fair to Austin Butler, I mean, he played Buck Clevin pretty well. That's kind of who Buck Clevin was that even keel guy, because it was kind of a two-man duo where Buck was always kind of the even keel, calm, serious person, and even in real life, people kind of were like wondering, what is Egan doing? Can
you not see that in the images we've seen of Egan? When they show you there is something about every time you see a picture of from the archive of Egan, you are just like, I'm going to hang out with this guy. He's a fucking crazy. Like, this guy is so much goddamn fun.
He wore the fez to briefings. Like, there's pictures of it at briefings. But also, what's kind of interesting, I think, in looking at kind of, I guess you could say, this duo is that, again, I think with regards to Egan, basically he is a bit unpredictable, and even the men kind of knew it, back then. Like, and usually when he showed kind of any elements of fear or like kind of being off and like showing a little sign of being nervous, that kind of made everybody uneasy, because what didn't make it into the film is as they're climbing into formation before the Munster raid, Egan crosses himself just randomly, just like, I got a bad feeling about this, and he crosses himself, and he'd never done that before. And like the pilot and the crews are like, uh-oh, this is not good. And so, but that's Egan. I mean, he is very unpredictable, and sometimes you don't know what he's thinking, but at the same time, sometimes you do, and it's really disturbing. So again, he's really all over, and again, portrayed it very well. The problem that Butler got a very, very even keel guy and played it perfectly. So he's not going to stand out as kind of the serious, more straight-laced guy.
I mean, I agree with you on that, and honestly, like, because of the way the show is split up, you don't have a lot of airtime either. Right, that is part of the problem. But I mean, what's Damian Lewis playing Dick Winters? That's another like even keel, like always, constant fire guy. And I sure was drawn to him a lot more than I felt drawn to Austin Butler in this show. But again, he did have all these episodes was really the focal point, had a lot more probably lines even just to sort of bring out his personality. So I think that's a good point too.
Look, man, Egan is Han Solo of this series. I mean, that's just what he's got the fun role. All right, let's bring this series in for a landing, Sarah. Final thoughts, Dr. Myers.
Oh, geez. I feel like we've already said so much. I would say that my top takeaway is I appreciated them incorporating the voices and personalities of these men from primary sources. That for all the holes that we saw and lack of development in places, I appreciate that they at least were able to like do that well and bring that in. Because even Alexander Jefferson, who I wanted to see more of his story and more of the Tuskegee Airmen, they did really well by his memoir, because I went back and reread it just to kind of see, and so I thought, at least they did that. So that's my takeaway.
Dr. Truxal.
Overall, I'd say this is the best portrayal on the air war from the American perspective that I've seen, even eclipsing, shall I dare say, 12 O'Clock High, because it included more perspectives. I know I'm going to catch a lot of flack for that, but I do think because it covered more perspectives, it did a better job. Yes, there's obvious holes that we've talked about over the course of the series, and yes, it left a lot on the table in terms of potential. But a positive way to look at this is that it's very good. It's the best we've seen. It has raised the bar in what we should expect from a TV series and depiction of the air war to where we should demand more now. And we should demand people to do better than this. And so overall, it is the best out there. It has raised the bar. And so I'm very happy with it. I thought it was a very good series, even with the problems that it had.
Dr. Colbourn.
I'm so excited to go back through and watch Band of Brothers, go back through and watch the Pacific again, and
see you.
sort of and take it all in. I thought, of course, also sort of having started myself as a historian of the Pacific and the Marines, and really dealing a lot with the Pacific in my career now. I also deal a lot with the bombers of the 8th Air Force. And it was so incredible to see that dramatized in an excellent sort of way. I thought the CGI was great. I thought the intensity of those battles in those middle episodes especially were so, so good. And I think that's really important to have out there. The accuracy of, things that most people don't think about, like, frostbite and the temperature at altitude and just little small things like that, I thought were really good. Sarah's point about the primary sources is also really good. And I think that having these out there is such a great thing for students too, because you can also sort of lay a missing aircrew report or an action report in front of your students and say, watch these 10 minutes and now compare the two and tell me where they got it right or wrong, and sort of use that as a teaching thing. I think that's great. It had its flaws. I'm super disappointed that we went absolutely nowhere with the with Alexander Jefferson and Macon and those guys in the last episode, and that really kind of felt like we just sort of fell off there at the end. But otherwise, I'm so glad that they did this, and I hope that it has. I mean, clearly, and Luke, I know you've probably seen this too. As part of my job, I've liked and followed all the bomb groups and fighter groups that I can ever find on Facebook, and they're all exploding. And every week, membership is up, interest is up, people are talking, and this is really getting its day right now. And I think that that's really important. And so for those reasons, I think it's excellent. And I can't, I can't say it enough. I hope there's another season. No matter what they're definitely going to listen to this podcast. They're going to listen to all our suggestions, and they're going to pick one of Luke's ideas. But either way, I think it's going to be amazing, and I would look forward to that too.
Well, guys, thank you so much. I came to you guys, I don't know, a couple of months ago. It's like, hey, would you like to be chained to me for the next 8 weeks to do this series? And you said, okay, yeah, let's do this. And if you're listening in now, I hope you understand, like, it's a lot to sit down and schedule this thing and to kind of say, okay, every Sunday I'm going to be here and I'm going to watch this show. And then, I'm not doing this because this is my specialty, but Colin and Luke and Sarah, I'm getting text messages throughout the week, every single week, where these guys are literally going back and reading through stuff and coming up with notes and different ideas and spoiling things. And Luke is smiling now. It's been a labor. This has been real work to put this together for you. And I say that because I just want you guys to know how much I appreciate Colin and Luke and Sarah for believing in HATM and believing what we're trying to do here, but also trying to put this together for you guys in a way that makes sense, that does justice to the lives of these men and women that are portrayed in this film or in this series, and how much it means to me, first and foremost, to have you guys as my friends, to be able to do this with you guys. This means the world to me. So thank you guys so much again for being here. And let's do it again sometime.
And then he flew off into the sunset.
Well, again, thank you for having us on. And again, I was thinking like that last line in Band of Brothers, we precious few, we band of, I guess, I don't know if podcasters or something. I need to come up with some kind of clever line for that at the end.
Masters of the airwaves, Luke. It's right there. Gosh.
Yeah. Thanks for bringing me on halfway through, guys. I really appreciate that.
You just started showing up one day. You were like that scene in High Fidelity where like they just started showing up every day. It's like, don't worry, Colin. Colin's coming back from many other series. We're already plotting. So stay tuned for Colin and Sahara. Guys, thank you so much for being here.
This has been fun. Thanks Jason.
Everyone. Thank you. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
All right, guys, thank you so much for being here, for listening in for the last 8 weeks here for HATM for this series. We have more new series coming for you very shortly. We're going to launch into the series Franklin, where Luke Truxal is going to come back in and talk about the air war over France in 1779. But in all seriousness, we do have other series coming for you, these special things. You guys keep wanting them. We got Franklin coming up. We got a few other ones coming up. We're going to be revisiting John Adams later on in the year, as well as a few other series. So thank you so much for continuing to be here, for continuing to listen, for continuing to share HATM with your friends. And we will see you later. Ciao for now. Bye.